But they're made very quickly, and people don't have to ask them. To Linda, I just wanted to say, the injunction to protect the weak is a very difficult one to interpret, and I just wanted, at some point, your comments on how the precautionary principle actually does that, because one of my problems with the precautionary principle is that it protects people against innovation, but not always against the things that innovation might protect them from. And it's always leaning on the side of regulating science rather than encouraging it. To George, I detected an inconsistency in his apparent embracing of the idea that it was bad to have one law in Athens and another in Rome, but his celebrating the differences between the idiosyncratic states in the United States for having different interpretations of all sorts of things. And finally, to Professor Ashford, the environmental protection addition to the Rawlsian principles is, I mean, really needs some spelling out. What counts as the environment? I mean, does it include viruses? What counts as a species that we want to protect? I mean, does anybody in this room know how many species of anything there are in the universe, right? Now halve that figure, and is that a terrible, no, since nobody knows how many species there are, nobody knows whether it would be a bad thing or a good thing if there were half that number or a quarter of that number or 17 times that number. So there's a huge amount of unspecificity about what is to be included in environmental protection, in protection of species, and so on. And it certainly doesn't include the smallpox virus. So how do we actually navigate ourselves through what is supposed to be protected and what is not? And as for, this applies to wild type and genetically modified. Does it apply to animals that have been modified by selective breeding over the years? In the same way as it applies to wild types, if there are any wild types of anything left, and so on. I think it's hopelessly incoherent.
Okay, thank you very much. By the way, I do understand that the proceedings are going to be made part of a podcast, and I think also transcribed. Can I say I hope that will include, if the speakers wish it, the slides. And in the case of Professor Ashford, for instance, and I very rudely prevented him because the Rawlsian principles were particularly fascinating, especially the third one, as we've just heard, which needs much more careful study. Right, let's have another speaker from the floor, please. The gentleman in the blue suit. Yes, you, sir. Correct. Yes, blue suit and striped tie.
I first like to say that I enjoyed all presentation.
Your name and position, please.
My name is Paraskevopoulos. I'm a professor at the National Technical University of Athens. As I was just saying, I enjoyed very much all presentations today. Thank you all for such a good job. My question is this. Of course, we're talking here about global governance. We're talking here about organizations that will protect the environment, and so on and so forth. To my mind, it comes the idea that, of course, many years from now, I'm asking you if this is a good idea, to have a world referenda, to have a planetary referenda to decide on these very basic things. Now, maybe this is a bad idea. Of course, my suggestion is, if this is a good idea, to do it many years from now, in 30 years, in 50, in 100 years. But imagine, ladies and gentlemen, if we agree on this, the very one day that all voters on our planet will come to vote on something that concerns everybody. Of course, it will take a lot of education, a lot of informing, so that people will know what they are doing. And they will know that if they vote for this, there's a lot of possibilities, they have to do things that to help it out. So my question is this: how do you see this idea? It's something to forget about it, or something to postpone it for the next 100 years, and so forth? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And maybe the question for the referendum could be the Rawlsian third principle itself. That might be an excellent proposition, although, as I said, we need to look at it more carefully. Now, Sir Peter, yes.
Yes, Peter Lackman, University of Cambridge. I want to just come back to the question of global bioethics. If I can just repeat what I tried to say yesterday, I think this is actually not possible and desirable anyway, because ethical systems require to compete to see which works better in a given environment. And what that is really saying is that ethical prescriptions do need outcomes, which normally have to be measured in long time. The fact that we think they're a good idea doesn't actually mean they're going to work out well. I think clearly, apropos of what Dr. Nielsen said, there are certain things, respect for human dignity, truthfulness, honesty, which are not really controversial. But there are a number of highly controversial areas of bioethics: reproductive ethics, embryo and stem cell research, approaches to risk, and particularly the issues of informed consent and confidentiality, where the current highly fetishistic continental European approach, which is very libertarian and actually says consent is not only necessary but more or less sufficient for everything that isn't actually prevented by law, actually has very harmful side effects when it is exported. And I've already given Linda an example that whereas in the 1960s we were able to eradicate smallpox on the basis of community consent, where millions of children were immunized in a day, we are now completely incapable of undertaking the eradication of malaria by transmission-blocking vaccination. Although WHO has published a paper saying this is a universal public good, because it is no longer possible to immunize whole populations of people without their individual consent. And this is politically so difficult that nobody's actually so far tried to do it anywhere. And all I wish to say with this is that really one has to be very careful about trying to globalize bioethical things of this description, even within Europe.
Forgive me interrupting you, but I mean, who would dispute that one has to be very, very careful? But do these scientific problems lead one to the conclusion that an attempt to establish an ethical code is simply impossible? Because that would be a very, very grave conclusion to reach.
Not only impossible, highly undesirable. They have to compete so that outcomes can tell which one works better.
Right, I want to try and bring someone in who hasn't, as far as I know, spoken. Sir, you at the front.
Thank you, Chairman. Nikos Frangakis, the legal counsel to the Eugenides Foundation. Professor Christie especially mentioned the European Convention of Human Rights. Louder, right, louder. The European Convention of Human Rights were mentioned before, and of course there are also various other international instruments pertaining to human rights. Some of them, probably the most important or the most widespread ones, are already over 50 or 60 years old. So there's certainly a need to establish environmental protection as a clearly defined human right among the other rights of the first, second, and third generation. The question, though, is how cases that emanate from the protection of the environment, which are routinely and usually intranational, because, of course, damages to the environment, especially the ones that have to do with the sea and the air, know no borders. How could we reach a system that would penalize, criminalize this sort of damages? Let's say, let's take as an example the latest spillage in the Mexican Gulf. Do you think that there would be a day in which we'll reach to the point that environmental damages could be defined as crimes against humanity and therefore being referred to a special international court, probably to the already existing criminal code, to undertake, let's say, one more burden to adjudicate over such kind of damages? Thank you.
Yes, Professor Varoufakis.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I know I'm courting controversy, especially when we have a panel of lawyers and also a number of lawyers in the audience. But
you're here to court controversy, so go ahead.
Well, this was my way of saying this, exactly the same thing, a little bit more politely. My worry is that at a time when the very idea of greening humanity should be seen as juxtaposed against a very well-organized and funded campaign to brown humanity. This is a state of war we find ourselves in at the moment. We can have this conference and we can have a very nice and polite and heartwarming exchange about values and virtues that we think are important. But out there, the clock is ticking and action that needs to be taken is being impeded by a very formidable coalition of interests whose purpose is to stop any of the great ideas that are being discussed in this auditorium being implemented.
So your solution to that problem is?
No, I don't have a solution. I have a question and a comment, and I'll try to be quick. Whenever in that kind of strategic exchange or discursive warfare, one pins one's colors on the mast of a particular concept, like, for instance, justice, environmental justice, one should always try to imagine what the other side will do to undermine one's narrative. Now, from the 1970s, since Professor Ashford mentioned John Rawls, you remember, Nicholas, what happened after the publication of the Theory of Justice in 1971. We had another publication 3 years later by Robert Nozick, which effectively annulled everything that Rawls succeeded in putting on the table. The point here is very simple. Yes, and it's a very bad book. It's called Political Liberalism. But let's not, let me be brief. If we pin our colors on the mast of justice, the opposition is going to turn to a different concept, such as rationality, such as efficiency. And every time, at least judging from the past 20 years or so, justice has been pitted against efficiency and rationality. Justice has lost out, and it has been shown to be an ill-defined concept.